Okay, tonight we're stepping into the quiet stillness of 1975 Florida, where the golden light glides across Lake Monroe, masking the darkness that waits beneath. It's the kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace, but to something far older, heavier, a secret buried so deep in the soil that even time hesitated to disturb it. Until now, welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Tonight, we return to a mystery suspended in time, the disappearance of Angelina Moore, a woman whose life vanished in the span of a single morning, only for her truth to resurface 50 years later. This is not merely a story about crime or justice. It's a meditation on time itself, on guilt that never truly fades, and on the quiet, relentless way truth endures, waiting, patient, beneath the dust of forgotten years. The Florida summer of 1975 wrapped Lake Monroe in a deceptive calm. Dawn began like a watercolor painting, mist rising from the shoreline, the orange groves glowing under a pale gold sky, the air trembling with humidity. The stillness was almost sacred, the kind of silence that makes you forget the world can ever be cruel. Yet that silence was a disguise. Beneath the mirrored surface of the lake, beneath the easy rhythm of rural life, something was quietly fracturing. It was July 19th, a Saturday, the height of harvest season. While most of the county still slept, Angelina Moore was already awake, moving through the dim kitchen of her farmhouse, her steps measured, deliberate, like someone trying to steady herself before a long day. She was 27. To the people who knew her, Angelina embodied the spirit of the land, sun-browned skin, calloused hands, and a quiet resolve that came from years of tending the groves her late father had built. She was not rich, but proud, not loud, but unmistakably present. Locals called her the light of the grove, and they meant it. Her laughter once carried across the rows of citrus trees like music. But light, no matter how bright, can fade without anyone noticing. The previous year's harvest had failed. Storms and disease had cut deep into her profits, and the banks were tightening their grip. She had debts she never spoke of, letters she never answered, and nights where sleep came only in fragments. People began to see less of her at the diner, at church, at the Friday markets. Something inside her seemed to be dimming, slowly, silently. On the kitchen table lay her worn leather planner. The last thing she had written the night before was simple: meeting, noon. No details, no address. Just those words, pressed in dark ink as though she wanted to remind herself not to forget. The name beside it was one she probably hesitated to write. Richard Hale. Hale had once worked for her. A laborer who knew the groves as well as she did, until he was caught stealing fuel and spare equipment. She had fired him, but not before enduring weeks of arguments about pay and accusations that she had ruined him. People said he was a hard man to forgive, and an even harder man to cross. He was the kind of presence that made others uneasy. Broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, eyes pale and restless. He had the rough charm of a man used to getting his way through volume and force. He drank too much, talked too loud, and carried grudges like they were part of his blood. After losing his job, he drifted from place to place, taking odd work and leaving behind whispers that seemed to darken every town he passed through. Lake Monroe, though small, wasn't a place of innocence. In quiet towns, people pretend peace is natural, but it's only ever borrowed. Beneath the friendliness, beneath the ritual greetings and shared barbecues, lies the same complexity found anywhere: the envy, the resentment, the secret disappointments that never make it into conversation. And sometimes, when the right two lives collide at the wrong moment, those emotions ignite into tragedy. That morning, as the sun lifted higher, Angelina locked her door, slid into her pickup truck, and drove down the dirt path that cut between the groves. The air shimmered with heat. Cicadas screamed from the trees. No one saw her again after that. By early afternoon, her neighbor, Mrs. Leroy, noticed something strange. Angelina's truck hadn't returned, yet the dog at her porch kept barking toward the road. Evening came, and the truck was found less than a mile away, parked awkwardly near a stand of cypress trees. The driver's door hung open. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse rested untouched on the passenger seat, wallet and license inside. Deputies arrived before dark. They found tire impressions in the mud and a set of boot prints, large, deep, leading toward the woods and never coming back. The earth smelled of rain and something faintly metallic. Nothing was stolen, nothing vandalized. It was as if the scene had been frozen mid-motion, the story cut off before its final sentence. The search began before the sun disappeared. Flashlights flickered between the trees, dogs barked against the wind, and voices called her name into the thickening dark. But the woods gave nothing back. By midnight, the only sounds were the steady chorus of frogs and the whisper of the lake brushing against its banks. When dawn returned, the same light that had blessed the groves the day before now felt merciless. People gathered on the road, whispering, staring at the truck like it might still hold an answer. Sheriff's deputies marked footprints, photographed the scene, and loaded the vehicle for evidence. Yet every image looked the same: an empty truck, an empty road, and a growing absence that no one could name. Psychologists call it the moment of rupture, the instant when reality splits, when the ordinary becomes impossible to trust. For Lake Monroe, that rupture began the second Angelina failed to come home. It spread like a stain through the town. Conversations faltered, routines broke, and even the stillness of the lake began to feel wrong. Neighbors told themselves it was a misunderstanding, that Angelina had simply gone away for a while, but deep down, they already knew. Some silences belonged to peace, others to loss. The one over Lake Monroe was the latter. That week hung heavy, the scent of oranges thick in the air, laughter muted, time standing still. Later, people would say the land seemed to know what had happened. That morning, so ordinary in its beginning, had quietly become an ending. By nightfall, the truth was already buried, somewhere in the dark beneath the still water and the whispering groves. Lake Monroe's beauty would never feel pure again. It had absorbed the echo of a woman who vanished at dawn. The investigation began the morning after Angelina Moore vanished. Lake Monroe woke to the sound of engines rumbling down its narrow dirt roads, patrol cars crawling past citrus trees, dogs barking in confusion at the sudden commotion. The sheriff's department, a handful of men in khaki uniforms and sweat-darkened hats, cordoned off the area around the abandoned truck. Within hours, the county police arrived to assist, their radios crackling through the heavy Florida heat. They combed through the groves, each row of trees casting long, thin shadows across the soil. The air was thick with the smell of sap and gasoline. Volunteers, neighbors, farmhands, even teenagers, fanned out in groups calling her name into the stillness. "Angelina!" they shouted, voices fading into the wind that swept across the lake. Only the cicadas answered. By noon, the searchers had found tire marks leading toward the woods. A broken branch snapped at chest height, and a faint chemical odor near where the truck had been parked. The ground was soft, pocked with prints. One set, larger than the rest, had sunk deep into the damp earth, each tread perfectly outlined. The sheriff knelt beside them, tracing the impression with his finger. "Boots," he muttered. "Men's size 11, maybe." But no sign of Angelina, no torn fabric, no trail, just silence, the kind that seemed to deepen the longer you listened. By the second day, dread began to replace hope. The newspapers in nearby Sanford ran small headlines: "Local woman missing from Citrus Farm." The photograph they printed, Angelina in a summer dress holding a basket of oranges, made the story feel heartbreakingly ordinary. She could have been anyone's daughter, sister, neighbor. On the third day, the heat broke. Clouds gathered, and the scent of rain hung over the fields. Around noon, a farmer named Ben Crenshaw noticed vultures circling above an old dry creek bed a mile south of the grove. At first, he ignored them. Dead animals were common in summer. But when the birds didn't scatter, he walked closer and caught a smell that turned his stomach. He ran for help. When deputies arrived, they found the ground disturbed, the sand clumped and uneven. A shovel cut into it, and within minutes, a shape began to emerge: fabric, hair, a pale arm. The scene fell silent. No one spoke. Buried in a shallow grave lay the body of a woman. The autopsy later confirmed what the town already feared. It was Angelina Moore. The blow to her head had been delivered with a blunt instrument, likely metal, possibly a wrench or crowbar. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no sign of sexual assault or robbery. Her jewelry was still there, her watch frozen at 9:47 a.m. It was as if the killer had struck once cleanly and then stopped. Near her body lay two foreign objects, a frayed, oil-stained canvas and a coarse rope knotted twice. Both were logged as evidence, but in 1975 science could go no further. Florida's humidity erased what truth remained. Fingerprints blurred, samples decayed, clues without proof. Suspicion quickly fell on one man, Richard Hale. He was the only person known to have quarreled with Angelina in recent weeks. Neighbors recalled seeing his truck in the area earlier that month. They remembered his temper, his drinking, his habit of muttering about getting even. When questioned, Hale insisted he hadn't seen her for weeks. He claimed he'd been working construction in Volusia County. His alibi rested on a friend S-word, a man with his own record of petty theft. The boot prints near the grove matched his size, but not uniquely enough to charge him. The sheriff's department lacked evidence, and the prosecutor refused to take the case forward. So Hale walked free. Lake Monroe, however, did not. The town's rhythm faltered. People who had once left doors unlocked began to bolt them before dusk. Women avoided driving alone on the back roads. Parents warned their daughters to stay away from the lake. The orange groves, once symbols of life and growth, now carried a quiet menace. At the funeral, the small church overflowed. The congregation sang softly, their voices thin in the summer air. The headstone was plain. Angelina Moore, 1948-1975. Below it, someone had left a single orange blossom. But among the mourners stood a man who could not let the case go. Detective Carl Devo, 32 years old, sharp-eyed, restless. He had worked the scene himself, lifting the canvas from the soil, bagging the rope, watching the coroner zip the body bag. Something about it didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the precision. Whoever killed Angelina hadn't panicked. The shallow grave was deliberate, the body positioned with care. Devo had seen crimes of passion before, chaotic, desperate, full of fingerprints and mistakes. This was different. This was control. It felt like remorse disguised as order. When the department finally closed the file, Devo did something that wasn't exactly procedure. He kept the oil-stained canvas, the one piece of evidence he believed would one day matter, locked away in his personal archive. Officially, it was lost in transfer. Unofficially, it was waiting. Years passed. The world changed. Devo aged. But every July, he returned to Lake Monroe. He would visit Angelina's grave, stand there in silence, and leave a single orange blossom. Those who saw him said he looked like a man visiting not the dead, but a promise he'd failed to keep. The grove changed hands. The dirt road was paved, the old creek bed filled in. Children grew up hearing half-remembered stories. Whispers of a woman who, D, vanished and a man who, D, gotten away. But time, like the philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, is a river. Everything flows forward, the living, the forgotten, and even the buried truths that refuse to stay still. And beneath the stillness of Lake Monroe, that truth continued to drift, silent, patient, waiting for the day it would finally rise to the surface. Nearly 5 decades later, the world had changed. What once required intuition now relied on algorithms. Machines could read what the human eye once missed. Computers cross-checked billions of data points in seconds, and DNA sequencing no longer belonged to science fiction. It was the language of the dead finally learning to speak. In the spring of 2023, inside a windowless archive of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, a new task force began reopening cold cases, files that had slept for decades under layers of dust and silence. The project was part of a statewide initiative to apply modern forensics to forgotten crimes. Most folders contained only fragments, faded photos, brittle reports, and evidence that time had nearly erased. Among them, one file stood out. The label, handwritten and slightly smudged, read, "Moore Case, 1975. Inside was a single sealed evidence bag, its seal yellowed, the tag brittle. Within it, the old piece of oil-stained canvas rested like a relic. The faint smell of machine oil and damp soil still lingered, the scent of a summer long gone but not forgotten. The team lead, a young investigator named Daniel Torres, had not been born when Angelina Moore died. To him, the case was history, not memory. But the story caught him, the isolation of the grove, the unfinished nature of the investigation, the sense of something deeply personal left unresolved. He decided to test the fabric once more, despite the long odds. The canvas was transferred to the forensic lab in Tallahassee. Using advanced next-generation sequencing technology, the technicians carefully extracted tiny fibers, washing them in sterile solution and feeding them into a machine capable of reading individual strands of degraded DNA. Hours turned into days. Then, a result, a partial male DNA profile, fragmented but viable. It was barely enough, but it was something. For the first time in half a century, the case had a voice. Through a process called genetic genealogy, the team began constructing a family tree. By uploading the DNA sequence into open-source genetic databases, public platforms used by people searching for relatives, they traced distant genetic matches. One by one, the branches narrowed, leading to a surname that had not been spoken in any courtroom for nearly 50 years. Hale. That name had haunted the early reports like a shadow. Richard Hale, the disgruntled former employee, the man with the size 11 boots, the one who had walked away untouched by the law. The algorithm confirmed what instinct had always whispered. Cross-checking public records and property deeds, investigators discovered that Hale had vanished from the map in the early 1980s, only to reappear years later under a new name, Robert Hale, in Ocala, a quiet town north of Orlando. Now 82, he lived alone in a weathered trailer at the county's edge. Surveillance showed a man of habit, sunrise coffee at a diner, a silent drive home, no family, no friends, only the echo of years unspoken. It took a week before they got what they needed. On the 7th morning, an officer posing as a sanitation worker retrieved a discarded coffee cup from Hale's trash can. That single object, the bridge between centuries, was enough. The DNA on the rim was tested and compared to the decades-old sample pulled from the canvas. The result came back within 48 hours, a match, 99.98% certainty, statistically irrefutable. When detectives arrived with the warrant, Hale seemed unsurprised. Inside his trailer, the walls were bare except for a small calendar and an old photograph of a farm, rows of citrus trees glowing beneath the Florida sun. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. It was as if he had been expecting this moment for years. During interrogation, he spoke slowly, his voice rough, his sentences fragmented by long silences. He said Angelina owed him back pay. They argued by her truck. She called him a thief. He remembered only a blur, a sound, a panic that ended with soil covering what he'd done. When asked why he never confessed, Hale whispered, "It wouldn't have changed anything." The report labeled it a confession, but it felt like surrender. News outlets called it the ghost case that solved itself. Yet for those who had known her, it wasn't justice, only disbelief. For half a century, Angelina's story had lived as rumor, legend, warning. Now, with her killer exposed, people drove past the old grove and the creek asking the same question. How can truth stay buried so long and still find its way home? For the investigators, the case became a symbol of what science could achieve. But beneath the data, there was something more human, something ancient. The belief that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of waiting. In forensic psychology, they call this phenomenon delayed closure. When justice finally arrives after decades, it doesn't erase pain, it simply gives it form. The wound remains, but it no longer festers in silence. For those who carry the memory, grief doesn't end. It transforms. The past stops whispering not because it has been silenced, but because at last it has been heard. Detective Carl Devo didn't live to see the resolution. He had died in 2019, 4 years before the DNA test. But in his personal effects, his daughter found a note tucked inside an old case folder. It read, "Keep the canvas. One day, it'll speak." And it did. Nearly 50 years after the quiet morning when Angelina Moore disappeared, the land itself seemed to exhale. The grove still stood, though the trees had changed. The lake still mirrored the sky, though the water had grown darker. For the people who remembered, Lake Monroe was finally still again, not because the silence was gone, but because it had been given meaning. Truth, once unearthed, doesn't restore what was lost, but it reminds us that even time cannot close every wound. Some remain open, witnesses to both the cruelty and endurance of the human soul. The trial of Richard Hale began on a gray morning in February 2025, a seasonless day, the kind that feels suspended between past and present. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras humming softly like distant insects. For Lake Monroe, this was not just the end of a criminal case. It was the closing chapter of a half-century-old wound. Hale appeared in court pale and diminished, wheeled in by a deputy. The years had hollowed him out. His once broad shoulders curved inward, his hands trembled visibly on the armrests, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. The man who had once swung a wrench in anger now looked like a figure carved out of regret and exhaustion. When the judge asked for his plea, he said only 2 words, "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no gasps or murmurs, only a long, collective stillness. After 50 years of unanswered questions, the truth had arrived, stripped of all drama. Hale was sentenced to life imprisonment in a secure medical facility, given his age and health. No one protested the leniency. No one demanded more. There was simply nothing left to take. Among those seated in the back row were Angelina Moore's surviving relatives, gray-haired, quiet, their faces lined by time and memory. They had not come for vengeance. When interviewed afterward, one of them said softly, "It feels hollow, but necessary." The verdict did not bring peace, but it did bring closure of another kind, the kind that allows a story to finally end, even if it never heals. In the weeks following the trial, local newspapers reflected on what it all meant. Commentators called it a victory of persistence, a case that proved technology could bend time. But beneath the celebration ran a deeper current, one that asked not how the truth emerged, but why it had waited so long. Psychologists often describe guilt as an unhealed wound, one that festers beneath the surface of consciousness, shaping behavior in invisible ways. For nearly 5 decades, Hale had lived beneath that wound. He changed his name, moved towns, learned to smile just enough to pass unnoticed. But the past never really disappeared. It lived within him, shaping the rhythm of his breathing, the slowness of his movements, the emptiness in his eyes. His life became its own kind of sentence, an existence haunted not by law but by memory. That, in many ways, is the paradox of guilt. You can bury a body, you can hide evidence, you can reinvent yourself, but you cannot bury your own mind. Memory has its own conscience. It waits, patient and unrelenting, until you meet yourself again. From a Stoic perspective, truth exists independently of feeling. It does not chase the guilty, it simply endures until it is seen. Seneca once wrote, "Time discovers truth, time heals what reason cannot." The case of Angelina Moore is a perfect embodiment of that principle. The sheriff who first opened the file in 1975 died decades before justice came. The detective who kept the oil-stained canvas in his private archive had long retired. His faith in eventual truth vindicated by science he never lived to witness. Justice, in this sense, was not swift, but it was inevitable. Like water-carving stone, time wore away denial until only fact remained. And yet beneath the legal clarity lies a moral question that the courtroom could not answer. Why did Hale kill her? Was it rage? Fear? Pride? He told investigators that Angelina had accused him of theft, that he snapped. But moments of violence rarely arise from a single word. More often, they come from something deeper, the collapse of identity, the shattering of pride. Many acts of violence are less about hatred than humiliation, a desperate attempt to reclaim control when the self feels small. Hale's blow was not just against a woman, but against the reflection of his own inadequacy. When pride fractures, reason falls with it. Viewed through a Buddhist lens, both victim and killer are bound by the same current of suffering. One suffered in life, the other in conscience. Karma, then, is not punishment but consequence, the natural unfolding of cause and effect. Hale's 50 years of secrecy were his purgatory. He carried his own prison within him long before the state imposed one. Every morning he woke, every night he slept under the weight of something nameless but inescapable. In that way, the final judgment was less a victory than a release. The truth, once spoken aloud, loses its poison. The silence that follows is not empty. It's transformed. When the judge finished reading the sentence, the courtroom seemed to exhale. The ceiling fans hummed softly, papers shuffled. Outside, the Florida sky had turned a muted gold. One of the reporters later wrote that as the gavel struck, a small gust of wind passed through the open windows, rustling the flags. It felt, she said, like the past itself had moved. For Lake Monroe, the case became more than a murder solved. It became a mirror, showing how long grief can live, how truth can sleep, and how justice, even when late, still matters. The townspeople who once whispered about Angelina now spoke her name without fear. Flowers appeared at her grave again. Lilies, daisies, the kind she had once sold at the local market. Her story, long trapped between rumor and silence, finally belonged to history, not mystery. And somewhere, beyond words, the silence that followed wasn't one of forgetting, but of release. The kind that comes not when a story ends, but when it finally finds peace. In the end, truth is its own requiem. It demands nothing, forgives no one, yet restores balance between what was done and what must be remembered. As the courthouse emptied, an elderly woman, once Angelina's friend, whispered, "She can rest now. He can't run anymore." And with that, 50 years of silence dissolved into the Florida air, leaving only the truth, patient, unburied, finally heard. 50 years have passed since that summer morning at Lake Monroe. The grove still glows under the same sun. The water still ripples quietly against the shore. But in every breeze that moves through those trees, there's a whisper of what once happened there, a reminder that even silence can remember. The story of Angelina Moore is not just about a murder solved. It is about how truth, however delayed, still finds its way through the cracks of time. It tells us that every act, no matter how deeply buried, leaves a trace in the world and in the human conscience. As we close tonight's episode, remember this: some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast. If you believe that justice is not only about punishment, but about truth finally being seen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because every story we tell is one more chance to listen to what time tried to forget.